Some people make up their mind about you long before you ever speak. And if you assume it's because of something you did, you already missed the real point. Most of the time, it has nothing to do with your actions on the surface. It happens in deeper layers that people don't even realize they are operating from. When your presence makes someone feel insecure, it's rarely because you did something obvious or offensive. It's usually because you reflect something they are trying to ignore in themselves. People constantly compare themselves to others, even without realizing it. So when you carry a quiet sense of confidence, steady energy, calm body language, and a grounded way of speaking, it sends a message that you are internally stable. To someone who is not stable inside, that kind of energy doesn't feel neutral. It feels uncomfortable. It creates pressure. Socially, people are always trying to figure out where they stand in relation to others. If they can't find a weakness in you to mentally place you below them or equal to them, they start feeling exposed. Your calm presence removes the usual ways they use to label people, like calling someone unsure, needy, or socially awkward. Without those labels, they are left with a silent comparison, and in that comparison, their own insecurities become louder in their mind. Instead of dealing with that discomfort internally, many people project it outward. That's why you might experience cold behavior, subtle resistance, or unexplained dislike. It can feel confusing because nothing direct seems to have caused it. But the reaction is not really about who you are as a person. It is about what your energy represents to them. You become a reflection of something they are not comfortable facing. And when people see in you something they feel they lack, it creates inner tension. Rather than understanding that feeling, they often turn it into judgment or distance. Another layer of this comes from how you are not playing the usual social game. Most people unconsciously seek approval in conversations. They adjust how they speak, soften their opinions, over-explain themselves, or signal agreement just to be accepted. It's a quiet system of exchange where everyone is trying to feel validated. When you step outside of that pattern, even without saying anything, people notice it. If you are not showing signs of needing approval, not apologizing unnecessarily, not trying to be liked, it creates uncertainty for them. And in social settings, uncertainty is often mistaken for loss of control. If someone cannot influence how you see yourself, they lose a subtle form of power they are used to having in interactions. That shift can feel unsettling. So instead of comfort, they may respond with distance, irritation, or passive dislike. What intensifies this even more is that your independence forces others to become aware of their own dependence on validation. Without saying a word, your behavior shows them a contrast. And that contrast is not always easy to sit with. Most people are not aware of how much their sense of identity depends on external approval. But they feel it when they are around someone who doesn't operate that way. And instead of reflecting on it, they often translate that discomfort into negativity toward the other person. There is also an unspoken structure in social groups where people naturally fall into roles of seeking approval and giving it. When you don't participate in either side, you become harder to define. You are not trying to impress, but you are also not submitting. That kind of presence disrupts familiar social patterns. And when people cannot place you into a category they understand, they often resist it without knowing why. So their reaction is not really proof that you are doing something wrong. It is more about how your behavior removes their usual tools for understanding and managing social comfort. Without those tools, they are left facing their own internal state, which many are not ready for. On another level, when you are more aware of people than they expect you to be, the dynamic shifts again. Every interaction carries small signals like changes in tone, pauses, facial expressions, and body language. Most people don't realize how much they reveal without speaking. When someone starts noticing these subtle details, even silently, it changes the interaction. You don't need to point anything out. Just your awareness alone is enough to shift how you respond. A slight pause, a different reaction, or a calm look can make the other person feel like they are being seen more clearly than they intended. That feeling can quickly turn into discomfort. Not because anything inappropriate is happening, but because most people expect their surface-level presentation to be accepted accepted without deeper observation. When you respond in a way that suggests you see beyond that surface, it disrupts that expectation. It makes interactions feel less predictable for them. And most people prefer predictable social exchanges where they feel fully in control of how they are perceived. So when that predictability is gone, they may feel uneasy. Not everyone will understand that feeling, but they will react to it in some way. In the end, a lot of what people call dislike or coldness is not about your personality directly. It is about how your presence interacts with their internal world, their insecurities, and their need for validation. What you start noticing is that people don't only react to what you say or do, but also to what they think you understand about them. The moment someone feels like you've picked up on something they didn't intend to show, it creates a shift. It makes them question how much of themselves you can actually read and whether they still control the image they are presenting. For people who depend heavily on managing how they are seen, that uncertainty can feel unsettling. There's another deeper layer here too. When someone has a certain self-image, like believing they are confident, calm, or in control, and your awareness picks up something different in them, like hesitation, tension, or hidden frustration, it quietly clashes with the version of themselves they want to maintain. That clash creates inner discomfort, and instead of sitting with it, many people naturally push that discomfort outward. So the reaction you get is not really about your observation itself, but about what your awareness takes away from them, which is the feeling of being unseen or unreadable. You become someone they can't easily perform for anymore. They can't fully predict how you will interpret them, and that removes a kind of psychological safety they are used to having in social situations. When you stay calm, especially in tense moments, you also break another common pattern people rely on. Most interactions follow a rhythm where emotions escalate on both sides. One person gets reactive, the other responds with similar intensity, and the situation feeds itself until it levels out at a shared emotional high point. It's almost automatic for many people. But when you don't match that escalation, the pattern collapses. Your calm presence creates an imbalance. The other person is expecting emotional feedback that matches their intensity, but instead, they are met with steadiness. That can leave them feeling like their emotional output has nowhere to go. It doesn't land the way they expected, and that can quickly turn into frustration. In many cases, emotional reactions are also used, consciously or not, as a way to influence others. Anger can push pressure, urgency can speed up decisions, and emotional stress can pull someone into agreement. When you stay composed, speak slowly, keep your tone steady, and don't get pulled into that emotional pull, those tools stop working the way they usually do. And because of that, people sometimes misread your calmness. They might see it as distance, arrogance, or even dominance. Not because you are trying to project that, but because they are used to equating emotional intensity with control or strength. So when you don't lose control while they feel like they are, the contrast becomes very noticeable. That contrast can be uncomfortable, especially for someone who is used to using emotion as influence. Your stability makes their emotional state more visible to themselves. The calmer you are, the more their agitation stands out. Instead of adjusting, some people either try harder to pull you into their emotional state or they pull away completely. What they are really reacting to is the fact that the emotional synchronization they expected is not happening anymore, and they are left alone with their own intensity. This is also why not oversharing has a strong effect on social dynamics. When you don't give away too much about yourself, you create space, and most people are not used to space in conversations. They rely on information to build a sense of control over who they are dealing with. The more they know about someone's thoughts, emotions, and personal life, the easier it is for them to categorize and predict that person. Oversharing often looks like connection, but a lot of the time it's really about reducing uncertainty. It makes people feel like they understand you quickly, even if that understanding is shallow. When you don't offer that level of access, you interrupt that process. Instead of having a clear picture of you, people are left with gaps. And the mind doesn't like gaps, so it starts filling them in automatically. That's where projection begins. If someone is insecure, they might assume you are judging them. If someone is distrustful, they might assume you are hiding something. None of that comes from you directly. It comes from how their mind tries to make sense of what it doesn't fully understand. There is also a subtle control aspect to this. Fast familiarity can sometimes be used as a way to build influence or comfort quickly. When you don't offer that immediate emotional openness, you remain slightly harder to reach. And for people who are used to quick emotional access, that can feel frustrating. They may interpret your restraint as emotional distance or superiority, when in reality it's just selectiveness in what you choose to share and when. Over time, this makes you harder to define in simple terms, and anything that cannot be easily defined tends to create more thought, more interpretation, and often stronger reactions from people who prefer clarity and control in social situations. That kind of silence or restraint you show doesn't leave people neutral. It creates stronger reactions in them. Some become more curious about you, while others become defensive without fully understanding why. The discomfort they feel is often not because of something you said, but because of what you didn't say. The space you leave behind forces their mind to fill in the blanks. When you start improving quickly in visible areas of life like discipline, communication, confidence, or success, it quietly disrupts something most people don't talk about openly. Everyone carries an internal expectation of how fast growth should happen. For many, it is slow, linear, and heavily dependent on circumstances. So when someone seems to accelerate beyond that expectation, it doesn't just look like progress, it challenges their entire way of thinking. At first, people may not even consciously process what they are seeing. They just notice changes. You speak more clearly, your decisions look sharper, your presence feels more grounded, or your results start stacking up faster than expected. And almost immediately, comparison begins. And comparison is rarely peaceful. It forces people to adjust how they see themselves. If someone believes they are doing their best, but sees you moving further ahead in a shorter time, it creates internal tension. That tension doesn't always turn into admiration. In many cases, it comes out as doubt, criticism, or subtle dismissal. People may start questioning your methods, your timing, or even your authenticity. Not because there is real proof against you, but because your progress makes them question their own pace. The mind finds it easier to doubt someone else's success than to accept personal stagnation. There is also a deeper emotional side to this. Fast improvement reminds people that change is actually possible, but at the same time, it highlights something uncomfortable. Not everyone is willing to go through the effort, discipline, and discomfort required for that change. Most people understand what needs to be done, but only a few consistently act on it. So when your results start showing clearly, you unintentionally expose the gap between what people intend to do and what they actually do. And that gap is not always easy for them to face. Because of that, the reaction you get is not always about disagreement with you personally. It is often about what your progress represents. You become a living reference point they did not choose for themselves. And once that comparison is formed, many people protect their self-image by explaining your success away, calling it luck, timing, or an exception, instead of confronting what it might reflect about their own decisions. The same dynamic appears when you have strong boundaries that others cannot easily cross. It changes the way people relate to you. Most social interactions are built on small adjustments, unspoken flexibility, and testing limits over time. People often push a little, observe your response, and then adjust their behavior based on what they can get away with. Over time, this creates an unspoken expectation that access to you is negotiable. But when your boundaries are clear, steady, and not open to emotional pressure, that pattern stops. You don't over-explain them, you don't soften them, and you don't shift them just to make others comfortable. This creates clarity. People understand there are lines, and those lines are not changing. For some, that feels grounding because it removes confusion. For others, it feels like rejection or resistance. The discomfort usually comes from expectation. Many people are used to situations where persistence eventually leads to access, whether it is emotional closeness, attention, forgiveness, agreement, or approval. So when that strategy no longer works with you, it disrupts something they are used to relying on. And that disruption is often what shapes their reaction more than anything you actually do. What often happens is that people don't even realize they are trying to cross your boundaries. They are simply following a learned pattern. When something they were used to being accessible suddenly isn't available in the same flexible way, it creates discomfort. They interpret that shift through emotion rather than logic. So instead of recognizing structure, they may see rejection. Instead of seeing consistency, they may label it as coldness. But in reality, what they are facing is simply clarity. When your boundaries are firm and consistent, there is no guessing, no bending, and no hidden space to push through slowly over time. People who are used to flexible limits often mistake structure for hostility, because structure removes their ability to influence things gradually. If someone cannot slowly test how far they can go with you, they are forced into only two options: adjust their behavior, or step away. And not everyone is willing to adjust. There is also a deeper psychological layer connected to control. Boundaries clearly define where your influence ends and where someone else's begins. When you enforce them without inconsistency, you remove ambiguity from the interaction. And ambiguity is exactly where many people try to gain subtle control or advantage without directly asking for it. Without that uncertainty, they can no longer test limits or slowly stretch the rules in their favor. That can create frustration in people who are used to emotional flexibility in relationships, where boundaries shift depending on mood, pressure, or persistence. So again, the reaction you receive is not always disagreement with your boundaries themselves. It is more about the loss of access they assumed was negotiable. You become someone they cannot approach in the same flexible way they expected, and that forces them to deal with limits they didn't prepare for in their behavior around you. On another level, when you don't follow the unspoken rules of social behavior, you step outside a system most people are not even consciously aware of. These rules are never written down, but they are learned through repetition from a young age. Things like when to laugh, how long to hold eye contact, how quickly to agree, which opinions feel safe, and when to soften disagreement. All of these small patterns create a shared rhythm in social interactions. It keeps communication smooth, predictable, and comfortable for most people. But when you don't automatically follow that rhythm, things start to shift. Maybe you pause instead of reacting instantly. Maybe you stay quiet when others expect agreement. Or maybe your response doesn't match the emotional tone of the group. To you, it might feel natural, honest, or neutral. But to others, it feels like a break in the pattern they are used to. Human beings are extremely sensitive to patterns in group behavior. When everyone is subconsciously aligned in how they act, and one person breaks that flow, attention naturally moves toward that difference. And that difference stands out more than anything else happening in the interaction. Not because it is wrong, but because it doesn't fit into what people expect. When something becomes unpredictable in a social setting, the first reaction is usually discomfort. Only later, if at all, does it get understood as individuality. This is where perception starts to change. Instead of simply seeing you as someone who behaves differently, people may start attaching labels like difficult, distant, arrogant, or off. These labels are not accurate descriptions of you, but mental shortcuts. The mind uses them to quickly resolve the discomfort of not being able to clearly define someone. It is always easier for people to assign a label than to sit with uncertainty. Ambiguity creates mental pressure, so the brain tries to close the gap as fast as possible, even if the conclusion is wrong. There is also another layer beneath this related to social safety. Every group runs on unspoken rules that reduce friction and keep interactions smooth. When someone doesn't follow those patterns, it can feel like the balance of the group is being disturbed, even when nothing harmful is actually happening. People who rely heavily on social alignment can react defensively in those moments, not because you are attacking anything, but because your behavior doesn't match the stability they are used to. It challenges the quiet system they depend on to feel socially secure. Over time, this naturally creates distance, not always because of direct conflict, but because you are no longer operating within the same set of expectations. You are responding based on what is real and present, while others are responding based on what is socially expected. That mismatch alone is enough to create confusion, and confusion often turns into resistance, misunderstanding, or silent discomfort, even when no one can clearly explain why. In many cases, what looks like people disliking you is actually just their mind reacting to something it doesn't know how to process. When you step away from approval seeking, stay emotionally steady under pressure, see situations clearly, grow at your own pace, maintain strong boundaries, and stop following invisible social scripts, you don't become wrong or flawed. You simply become harder to place inside other people's mental categories. And when the mind cannot easily categorize someone, it rarely stays neutral. It starts filling the unknown with assumptions, emotions, and interpretations. Sometimes that turns into distance, sometimes criticism, and sometimes quiet dislike. But underneath all of that, the core issue is usually the same. You are not matching their expectations. None of these traits are actually problems. They are just forms of presence that don't conform to what most people are used to. The important thing to understand is that people are not always evaluating you with full awareness or fairness. A lot of their reactions come from habit, comparison, and unresolved inner insecurities. So the real shift is not about trying to change how people respond to you. It is about understanding what their response is actually coming from. Because once you see that clearly, you stop taking every reaction personally. You stop assuming every cold response, every label, or every distance is a reflection of your worth. In reality, many of those reactions are just people dealing with their own discomfort when something doesn't fit their usual expectations.